4 penalties in 3 race weekends, an official governing body document forced into the open, and a 7-time world champion publicly admitting he simply, quote, can't catch a break. This is not a normal Formula One storyline anymore. This is a full-blown crisis, and the FIA has now been forced to put its own reasoning on paper, in black and white, for the entire world to read, and once you see the actual numbers written down in that official documentation, you are going to understand exactly why Lewis Hamilton lost his composure over team radio, why Fred Vasseur has started openly questioning the fairness of these decisions, and why this story has become impossible for anyone in the paddock to ignore. So stay with me for the next few minutes because we are going through this entire crisis, penalty by penalty, quote by quote, right up to the official FIA paperwork that finally exposed just how razor-thin these margins actually are. And let's start at the very beginning of this run of bad luck, because it did not begin in Hungary. It began at Silverstone, Hamilton's home race, the one weekend every driver builds their entire season around, and instead of celebrating in front of his own crowd, Hamilton was hit with a 5-second penalty for an alleged false start, a penalty he ultimately had to serve during his own pit stop, dropping him behind both George Russell and Max Verstappen in the process. And here is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because Hamilton later revealed something that most fans never even heard about, confirming that he formally argued that exact false start decision, and remarkably, the FIA actually agreed with his protest, which tells you everything you need to know about how fine these calls really are, a decision serious enough to cost him track position during his home Grand Prix, yet shaky enough that officials themselves later acknowledged his argument had genuine merit. And Silverstone was not finished with him either, because in that same race weekend he was also investigated for a yellow flag infringement, and this time, after reviewing what the FIA statement itself described as, quote, positioning and marshalling system data, video, timing, telemetry, and in-car video evidence, the stewards ultimately decided to issue only a reprimand rather than a further time penalty, allowing Hamilton to keep his third-place finish and let Ferrari celebrate a double podium. But even that outcome, technically a positive one, still meant Hamilton walked away from his home race having been formally investigated twice in a single weekend, and then came Hungary, where everything escalated even further, because during qualifying Hamilton found himself impeding Oscar Piastri's McLaren at turn 1, and the stewards moved quickly, confirming in their official ruling that in accordance with FIA regulations and established penalty guidelines, they were imposing a 3-place grid penalty on car 44, wiping out a genuinely brilliant qualifying lap and dropping Hamilton from second all the way down to 5th before the race had even started. And Hamilton, speaking to media afterward, explained exactly how the confusion unfolded, revealing that Ferrari had only warned him about Piastri's approach, in his words, quote, literally when he was at the apex behind me, meaning he genuinely had no idea another car was still on a flying lap behind him, and then, as if that was not enough for one single weekend, the FIA hit him again during the race itself, this time for a pit lane speeding infraction, and this is where the real bombshell landed, because after the checkered flag, the FIA released the full official penalty documentation for this exact incident, publicly confirming that Hamilton's telemetry clocked him at precisely 80.1 kilometers per hour, navigating a pit lane with a strict limit of 80 kilometers per hour, meaning the entire punishable offense came down to a margin of 0.1 kilometers per hour, a number so microscopic that under Article B1, 6.3a, the FIA's own regulations, any breach of the pit lane limit, no matter how marginal, automatically triggers a mandatory 5-second time penalty, and having that number written into an official FIA document, rather than simply reported secondhand by commentators, is exactly why this crisis reached a completely different level, because it removed all ambiguity. This was not exaggeration or fan outrage. This was the governing body's own paperwork confirming the punishment came down to 1/10 of a kilometer per hour. And Hamilton's fury over team radio in that exact moment now makes complete sense, telling his engineer, quote, handing out penalties like crazy, before adding afterward with real frustration, quote, every opportunity that I give those stewards, every single time they give me a penalty, and what makes this entire saga even more remarkable is that this was not even the first time Hamilton had been caught by this exact same razor-thin margin, because earlier in the season at the Monaco Grand Prix, He was also handed a 5-second penalty for going exactly 0.1 kilometers per hour over that circuit's pit lane speed limit, and at the time, a visibly exasperated Hamilton publicly called for an investigation into the FIA's own timing loops, saying he was, quote, shocked by the penalty, and insisting that he had engaged his pit limiter perfectly, and now, with 2 separate 0.1 kilometer per hour penalties on his record in a single season, the pattern has become impossible to dismiss as pure coincidence. But here is where fairness genuinely demands we look at the full picture, because it later became clear that Hamilton was not the only driver being caught by these exact microscopic margins, with reports confirming that multiple other drivers across the grid, 3, 4, even 5 separate cases, were penalized for the exact same kind of pit lane infringement, which actually suggests something slightly different from a personal vendetta against Hamilton specifically. It suggests a governing body applying an extremely strict, zero-tolerance interpretation of pit lane speed limits to everyone equally, a policy that happens to be catching Hamilton at an especially painful moment in his championship fight, rather than one specifically engineered to target him, and Fred Vassar's own comments throughout this saga capture that exact tension perfectly, because after the Silverstone false start penalty, he pushed back hard, telling reporters plainly, quote, from the sensors we don't see the car moving on the grid, directly challenging the technical basis for the call, but by the time Hungary rolled around, his tone had shifted towards something more reflective, describing the accumulation of these decisions using a phrase that has now become synonymous with this entire story, calling it, quote, small stone after small stone, and explaining that this pattern is not about one single game-changing moment, but about dozens of tiny margins stacking up over an entire season until they start to genuinely weigh on a driver's confidence and a team's championship hopes. And Hamilton himself, in his most candid moment of the entire saga, admitted after Hungary that the last 2 races had been, in his own words, quote, pretty bad from his side, before revealing something that genuinely deserves more attention than it received, explaining that drivers had actually raised this exact inconsistency issue directly with race control during a formal driver's briefing, telling reporters, quote, we did talk in the driver's briefing about the fact that they're inconsistent with this stuff, and pointing out that other drivers in the past have made similar marginal movements on the grid without being penalized at all, which raises the uncomfortable question at the very heart of this entire crisis. Not whether these penalties are technically correct according to the letter of FIA regulations, because in almost every single case they clearly are, but whether the regulations themselves, and more importantly the consistency of how they get applied from driver to driver and race to race, actually deserve the kind of hard, mathematical, zero-tolerance approach currently being used, because a sport built on split-second decisions made at nearly 200 miles per hour is now handing out career-defining penalties over margins smaller than 1/10 of a kilometer per hour, margins that no human being behind the wheel could realistically perceive or correct for in real time, and that is genuinely the emergency at the center of this entire story. Not necessarily bias against one specific driver, but a credibility question about whether Formula One's current penalty framework has become too rigid, too mathematically precise, for the sport's own good, right at the exact moment it is directly shaping the outcome of a genuine world championship battle. And with Hamilton now sitting 50 points behind Kimi Antonelli, heading into the summer break, every single one of these microscopic penalties carries championship-defining weight, because strip away even 2 or 3 of these decisions, and Hamilton's actual competitive position this season looks dramatically different from what the current standings suggest. And it is worth pausing here to really understand why this specific issue, pit lane speed limits measured down to 1/10 of a kilometer per hour, has become such a flashpoint across the entire grid this season, and not just for Ferrari, because when you actually look closely at the pattern of penalties handed out under this exact regulation, it becomes clear that Formula One management's timing infrastructure has become extraordinarily sensitive, capable of detecting speed variations that would have been completely invisible to race control just a few seasons ago. And while that level of precision sounds like a positive step forward for fairness on paper, catching genuine infractions that human observation alone would have missed entirely, it also means that split-second natural fluctuations in speed, the kind that happen constantly as a driver modulates a throttle pedal at nearly 200 miles per hour before slowing dramatically for a pit lane limiter, are now being treated with the exact same mandatory, zero-tolerance 5-second penalty as a driver who genuinely, deliberately, carelessly blew straight through a speed limit by 5 or 6 kilometers per hour. And that is really the uncomfortable technical reality sitting underneath this entire crisis. The regulations themselves do not currently distinguish between a driver who is dangerously, recklessly over the limit and a driver whose limiter software registered a reading that happened to land 1/10 of a kilometer per hour above a number that was, in the first place, somewhat arbitrarily set for that specific circuit. And once you understand that distinction, or rather the complete lack of one, you start to see why Hamilton's frustration and Vasseur's increasingly pointed public comments are not simply sour grapes from a driver having a tough championship fight. They represent a genuine, technically grounded challenge to how modern Formula One stewarding actually works. And it is also worth noting that this is not purely an abstract fairness debate either, because the timing of these penalties has had very real, very measurable consequences on this specific championship battle. Every 5-second penalty Hamilton has absorbed this season has directly cost him track position, points, and in some cases entire podium finishes that would have otherwise stood. And when you are fighting to close a 50-point gap against a driver as consistent as Antonelli has looked throughout this entire season, every single one of those lost positions compounds into something that genuinely threatens Hamilton's realistic path back into serious title contention. And this is exactly why so much attention is now being paid to what happens next, because Formula One has entered its mandatory summer shutdown, giving the FIA, the teams, and race control themselves 2 full weeks away from actual competition, time that could theoretically be used to revisit exactly how these pit lane infractions are measured and penalized before the second half of the season begins. And if the governing body does choose to use this window to quietly review or even adjust the tolerance built into these calculations, it would not just affect Hamilton, it would affect every single driver on the grid heading into Zandvoort and beyond. But if the FIA instead chooses to maintain the exact same zero-tolerance approach that has already produced 4 separate penalties against Hamilton alone this season, that decision itself sends a very clear message about where the governing body currently stands on this entire debate, prioritizing rigid consistency over any kind of contextual judgment, and either way, the paddock is going to be watching extremely closely for any signal, official or otherwise, about how this specific regulation gets handled once racing resumes, because at this point in the season, with a genuine world championship fight still very much alive and only 50 points separating the top 2 contenders, even a small technical adjustment to how these margins are calculated could meaningfully reshape the competitive picture for the remainder of 2026. So here is what we want to know from you, and I mean this honestly. Now that the FIA's own official documentation has confirmed these penalties came down to margins as small as 0.1 kilometers per hour, do you think Formula One needs to seriously reconsider how strictly these rules get enforced? Or do you believe rules are rules regardless of how small the margin happens to be? Drop your honest opinion in the comments below right now, because this debate genuinely divides even hardcore fans, and I want to see exactly where you all stand, and if you want to be here the moment this penalty framework gets challenged again, whether at Zandvoort or later in the season, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications immediately, because we will be covering every single update on this story before anyone else does. So like this video if you think this penalty crisis deserves far more scrutiny than it has gotten so far. Share it with any F1 fan who still thinks these decisions are simple, and I will see you in the next one.